scholar, critic, playwright, and cultural administrator. Is the author of the Cinema of Manuel Conde and editor of 4 volumes of the Orian Anthology, covering 4 decades in the development of Philippine cinema from 1970 to 2009. He has published pioneering books on the Philippine Comedia, Sinaculo, and Zarzuela, and is editor-in-chief of the 2 editions, 1994 and 2017, of the multi-volume CCP Encyclopedia of Philippine Art. He wrote and line-produced Sari and Kilit Dalena's Ang Kababaihan ng Malolos, 2014, based on his book, The Women of Malolos, 2004. He is founding member and former chair of the Manunuri ng Pelikulang Filipino and served as a member of the MTRCB board from 1998 to 2000 and briefly as chair in 2001. He was vice president and artistic director of the Cultural Center of the Philippines 1986 to 19.
Professor Nicanor Tiongson.
Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. Ang tatalakayin ko ay yung ugnayan ng teatro at saka ng pelikula sa Pilipinas mula 1919 hanggang sa 1960s. What the lecture wants to do is explain how Philippine theater got to be a major source and influence on Philippine film, to show how the traditional content and production style of the then current dramatic genre shaped or influenced parallel cinematic genres during this period, and 3, evaluate the significance of theater's influence on the different aspects of Philippine film production. First, theater, the necessary source and influence on film. When American When American pioneer filmmakers Edward Gross and Albert Yearsley shot their first feature films in the Philippines in 1912, these director-producers had no choice but to employ actors from Philippine theater simply because there were no other. Moreover, there was a steady supply of these artists available to work at most times of the year. For his one-hour movie, La Vida de Dr. Jose Rizal, Gross used the Benito Molina troupe of his wife, Tita Molina. For his 20-minute El Fusilamiento de Dr. Jose Rizal, Yearsley commissioned Severino Reyes' Gran Compañía de la Zarzuela Tagala to act out Rizal's execution scene in the Cementerio del Norte. And when Jose Nepomuceno decided he was ready for his first feature film in 1919, he chose the Zarzuela, hit of his time, and arguably of all time, The Lagang Bukid, written by Hermogenes Ilagan or Moning Ilagan, with music by Leon Ignacio, hiring as well the young stars Atong Dilarama and Moning's brother, Marceliano Ilagan, to play the original theater roles, along with members of the Compañía Ilagan. The actors sang and declaimed their parts in sync with the images on screen. This is a very valuable picture of the Compañía Ilagan, taken about maybe 1910 to 1915. Ilagan is the one at the center, sitting. While it is true that the early film directors tried to discover new faces for their movies, such as Mary Walter and Sophia Lotta, most of the mainstay of these early films were still around. Were actually taken from the source from the theater, like Juanita Angeles, Gregorio Fernandez, whose picture appears here, Patring Ormonang Carvajal, and Maria Tronquel, whose picture appears here also, who also appeared in Nena la Pojeadora. And Tidia Kawili confirms this. It says, the Zarzuela and vaudeville stage were the natural grounds from which the new industry culled the talents and technicians required. In fact, he continues, in the daytime, some stars would do movies, and at night, they would appear or be in their vaudeville shows. Leading theater families that straddled both theater and film and or eventually migrated to the movies were number one, the Ilagans, including Hermogenes and wife Casiana de Leon, a Zarzuela star, and children Conrado Conde, Gerardo de Leon, Tito Arevalo, Angel Esmeralda, Laling Talting, Edong Nagali, Nagali is Ilagan Baligtad, no? And their descendants, Liberty Ilagan, Robert Arevalo, J. Ilagan, and John Gibbs. Two, the Reyeses, including Severino, the patriarch, his youngest son Pedrito, and the latter sons Efren and Johnny Reyes. Three, the Carvajals, including Patrin, Ormona, Amelia, Eliseo, and Alfonso Carvajal. Four, the Siluses, including Manuel, Octavio, Augusto, Cesar, Leopoldo, Raul, and the Silos sisters. Five, the Lubao Zarzuela actors, Rogelio and Jaime de la Rosa, and Gregorio Fernandez, who, with Diosdado Macapagal, came out in Kapampangan Zarzuelas, produced and directed by Diosdado's father, Urbano. And six, the Salvadors, including vaudeville stars Lou and Miami Salvador, and their descendants, Leroy et al. Marami sila. Individual stars who began in vaudeville include Dolphy, Panchito, Chiquito, Bayani Casimiro, Tugo and Pugo, Tulindoy and Chichay in the picture, Aruray, Ike Lozada, and Herman Moreno. As these theater artists began to take on the different roles of producer, writer, director, actor, or film technician in film, they could not help but bring with them into the cinema the traditional content and style of production, as well as the worldview, didacticism, and overall aesthetics of the dramatic genres that they knew best. Traditional content would include the types of stories, themes, characters, plots, dialogues, while style of production would refer to the directorial style, acting, production design, lighting, and music. In the period of the silent film, 1912 to 1933, the first studio period, 1933 to 1942, and the second studio period, 1945 to the 1960s, the five major dramatic genres that influenced the cinema were the comedia, sinaculo, zarzuela, drama, and vaudeville. The first four were Hispanic in origin and spirit, the last American. Moreover, because film was vying for the audiences that had been raised on traditional theater, it had no choice but to take into consideration the theatrical genres that the audiences were already familiar with or fond of. Such consideration would in fact have come quite naturally to film producers like LVN's Doña Sisa, and Premier Siriaco Santiago, and even directors like Manuel Conde, Gerardo de Leon, and Gregorio Fernandez, because they themselves, like their audiences, would have been raised in the same dramatic traditions or have been exposed to the textual sources and aesthetic standards of these plays. The Comedia sources, so theater is also dependent on literature. Actually, it starts from literature. The Comedia sources, the awit and corrido, which rose to popularity from the mid-18th century to the 19th century, obviously still had a mass following from 1919 to the 1950s because they were still being published in bulk by publishers like P. Sayo and Juan Martinez in Manila and other imprentas in the provinces well into the 1950s. After that period, some metrical romances like Siete Infantes de Lara reached even more readers when they came out in comics form. The Sinaculos. Since it was published in 1814, the Tagalog Pasyong Genesis, also called Pasyong Pilapil or Pasyong Mahal, has been translated into other major languages, printed and reprinted to the 20th century, in the 20th century, chanted in public pabasas during Lent up to our day, and enacted on stage as the Sinaculo up to the present. Since the 1900s, Sinaculo has been performed in many versions and variations in the Tagalog, Pampanga, Bicol, and Ilonggo-speaking areas. On the other hand, the zarzuela and the drama would have been the regular fare for rich and poor audiences alike in the theaters of Manila from the end of the 19th century to the eve of the Pacific War. Many popular dramas and zarzuelas, like Patricio Mariano's verse zarzuela, Anak ng Dagat, were even printed for theater enthusiasts by the same publishers of the Passion, Awit, and Corrido during the American colonial period. Given the ubiquity and mass appeal of these theater forms, it is no wonder that film producers from 1919 to the 1960s literally borrowed from the theater its stories, characters, plots, as well as its style of acting, costuming, lighting, and music. In this way, did film producers attract the audiences of theater to film, eventually taking over some of these forms, for example, the zarzuela, and contributing to the death of the original stage version. Thus happened to the zarzuela. The first form, the Comedia. The Comedia is a play in verse which may dramatize the lives of patron saints, that's the Comedia de Santo, like Iligan City's Comedia de San Miguel, or the loves and wars between Christian kingdoms of Europe and the Muslim caliphates of the Middle East in an ahistoric medieval period. So this would be called, in our case, the Moro Moro, like the Doce Pares de Francia. Like the Awit and Corrido, or metrical romances, from which they are derived or sourced, the Comedia is didactic, preaching the veneration of Christian saints and the superiority of the Christian religion over Islam and all other religions. For its didactic purposes, the Comedia divides its characters into the Vida, which are the Christians, and the Contravida, which are the Muslims and all antagonists of the hero. Invariably, no matter how many miracles or coincidences it requires, the Christians win in the end, and the Muslims must choose between the cross or the gallows. Staged during town fiestas on entablados erected at the church plaza, the Comedia was supported by hermanos who spent for the 3-day affair and by townsfolk who directed, acted, or worked as stagehands in fulfillment of personal vows or panata, or in gratitude for favors sought from the saints or granted, like a good harvest, recovery from an illness, or today, passing the board or getting a job abroad. Important conventions of the Comedia are, number 1, the marches for exits and entrances; 2, the sing-song delivery of verses punctuated by gestures; 3, the costumes which identify the Christian kingdoms, black, green, or blue, and the Muslim caliphates, red; 4, the princesses donning male apparel as they travel to other kingdoms; 5. The jesters or pusong or lokayo, who comment on everything for laughs. 6. Magia or magical artifices, to represent miracles and magical events. And finally, 7, the most popular attraction of the Comedia, the Batalya or Eskremahan, choreographed sword fights between individuals or between kingdoms, which may be repeated upon audience request. Yung nasa picture is sa Paranaque, yung prinsesa nakasuot prinsipe at saka yung Muslim na sultan. From 1916 to the 1960s, major and minor studios made some of these romances into costume and eskremahan films. Rolando at Laura, 1939, 1952, Príncipe Tiongson, 1942 and 1954, Rodrigo de Villa, 1954, sorry. Siete Infantes de Lara, 1951 and 1973, Ibang Adarna, 1941 and 1955, Hari Villarba, 1954. But aside from movies deriving directly from actual metrical romances, there were also films fashioned in imitation of these narratives, complete with elements of romance, royal tournaments, European medieval costumes, castles, horses, and sword fights, like Príncipe Paris, 1949, Apat na Alas, 1950 in the picture, Príncipe Amante, 1950, and Príncipe Amante sa Britannia, 1951. The Comedia influence may be seen even in the later action films that were inspired by cowboy Indian westerns, James Bond secret agent flicks, and Chinese or Japanese martial arts stories or movies from the 1960s to the 1970s, which are characterized by, number 1, handsome and gentle heroes, the bida, forced to avenge their loved ones or the poor against cruel villains, the contrabida. 2. Fight scenes, battles between individuals and groups, or two gangs or armies. But now involving not swords, but guns of all sizes, chains, chaku, and other exotic weapons. This is Tony Ferrer, secret agent Tony Falcone. Number 3, the rescue of damsels in distress or victims of curses. Number 4, the presence of a comic sidekick of the hero, which is the pusong in the Comedia. 5, the presence of miracles or magic, that's the magia, no? Magic swords, magical stones, and amulets that ensure divine protection for the good hero, as seen in Panday. The influence of foreign action films may have changed the outer look of the action film, but the basic motifs and theme of these movies continued to use the oldest conventions of the Comedia. The Cenaculo. The Cenaculo is a verse play that teaches the history of Christian salvation from the creation of Adam and Eve to the life, sufferings, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, to the assumption and coronation of the Virgin Mary in heaven. Using the narrative structure and dialogue of its main source, the Pasyong Genesis, the local passion play enlivens its didactic story with apocryphal tales from Martir sa Golgotha, which is a novel, religious awit and corrido, and even stories from magazines. If the Comedia divides its characters into Christians, good, and Moros, bad, the Cenaculo distinguishes between the banal, holy people, good, which includes Christ, the apostles, and all who believe in Christ, and the Hudyo, bad, literally Jews, which, curiously enough, includes Pilate and the Romans, soldiers with the Jewish Annas, Caiaphas, Herodes, and the Pharisees, and all those who punish or reject Christ. Performed in the Lenten season, but especially during Semana Santa or Holy Week, the Cenaculo takes about 8 nights to complete its story from Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday. The annual Passion Play is usually supported by the Hermanos and staged by the barrio folk participate in it as actors, directors, designers, or stage hands in fulfillment of religious vows, again, panata. It is the director who teaches actors the conventions of the sinaculo. Number one, the punto or lamentative chant for the banal, and the dicho or straight delivery of verse for the hudyo. Two, the slow one-step funebre for the banal, and the jaunty pasodoble for the hudyo. And three, the different types of mustra, gestures, or action, movements required by the different scenes. A small band accompanies the marches, the scenes of romance between Magdalene and her apocryphal lover Boneres, and the scenes of Jesus' resurrection and ascension to heaven, and the climactic assumption and coronation of the Virgin by the Holy Trinity in heaven. Because it is associated with only the season of Lent, the film Passion Play would be shown only during Lent, and especially during the Semana Santa in movie houses, except on Holy Thursday and Good Friday when everything closed down. Such were Calvario de Jesus, 1952, which had many Estampita-inspired scenes, like the one in the picture, based on Da Vinci's Last Supper, and Ang Pagsilang ng Mesias, 1952, where the baby Jesus was played by Tirso Cruz III. Aside from such Christ films, however, cinematic hagiographies preaching the lives of Christian saints were also given as Lenten offerings by major studios for the instruction and emulation of the faithful. This included Santa Lucia, 1956, Santa Rita de Cassia, 1958, and Santa Teresa de Avila. But the more general and lasting influence of the Christ story is founded in the following conventions observed by the Zarzuela and drama movies. First is in the typology of characters, already mentioned earlier by Lumbera, which include one, the Christ figure who is oppressed but combats all evil even at the cost of his own life. For example, FPJ in Andalusia. Second, the Judas figure who betrays his patron and protector or exploits the weak and fearful. For example, Paquito Diaz in practically all his FPJ action films. Three, the Madre Dolorosa or sorrowing mother figure who loves beyond reason and without reserve, and forever prays for and weeps over the malfiances of her wayward children. For example, Rosa Aguirre in Siete Dolores, 1948, and for the Magdalena figure who begins as a sinner and later repents. For example, Rita Gomez in Talibandas, 1958, also a comic story. Second, the Cenaculo influence is evident in the theme of suffering, where physical or even psychological suffering is considered a virtue in itself, or where suffering and unwavering belief in God are necessary attributes of a quote-unquote good daughter, wife, and mother, or where suffering is the necessary prelude and premise to any kind of success, victory, or happiness. The Zarzuela. Around 1879, the first Spanish Zarzuela was performed by Spanish actors in Manila. By 1890, the first Tagalog Zarzuela, Budhing Nagpahamak, was staged in Bulacan. In 1902, Severino Reyes' Zarzuela on the Philippine Revolution, Walang Sugat, sounded the death knell of the Comedia in Manila, even as provincial playwrights had begun to write their own original Zarzuela in Ilocano, Cebuano, Pangasinan, Kapampangan, Bicol, Ilonggo, and Waray. A radical departure from the Comedia and Cenaculo, the Zarzuela is a light-hearted play with songs revolving around the love story between typical Filipino characters, speaking prose dialogue that approaches the colloquial. It addressed issues of the day, such as inveterate gambling, cockfighting or panginge, the usurious practices of the rich, the influx of foreign prostitutes, the buying of votes and other illegal election practices, the corruption of government officials, the colonial mentality of the Americanized youth, and the perennial conflict between rich and poor. Based on their stand on these issues, characters were either depicted as positive if they disapproved of these evil practices, and negative if they committed or believed in them. So bida contra bida for them. The zarzuela plot is encrusted with big dramatic events and liberally uses coincidences and deus ex machina to resolve the conflicts it presents and come to a narrative closure that is politically, socially, and morally correct by establishment standards. The zarzuela was staged in teatros on a proscenium stage where a front curtain masked the changes of scenes. Setting was denoted by specific backdrops called telones depicting the inside of a poor man's house, the interior of a rich man's house, the street with a view of the countryside, the town plaza, etc. with matching props. The writer-director often acted as the impresario of the group, getting sponsors for the shows, supervising the work of the composer-conductor in a small orchestra, the sets and props and lighting people, and the actors. Acting in the zarzuela, which had to be quote-unquote large on stage, signaled character types. Heroines act shy, virginal, kind-hearted, and loyal, while the heroes are kind, soft-hearted, chivalrous, and brave. Villains of both sexes are modern, quote-unquote, forward, sleek, and cunning. Similarly, costumes were markers of character, with heroes and heroines dressed in beautiful but conservative attire, and the villains in modern Americanized fashion. Aside from the acting, zarzuela actors had to learn the songs of the zarzuela, which were usually the traditional kundiman, balitaw, and balse, and newly introduced music from America, like the foxtrot, cakewalk, and charleston. Of all the dramatic genres, it was the zarzuela that was embraced by the medium of film. Even before the coming of sound, years they had done Walang Sugat in 1913 with Severino Reyes' group, and apparently it was a hit. While Nepomuceno chose the Lagang Bukid for his first feature film in 1919. And when sound came to local cinema, the largest percentage of films made by the studios of the first period were either film zarzuela, meaning the adaptations of existing zarzuela, like Ang Kiri, retitled Ang Mahiwagang Binibini, or zarzuela films, meaning zarzuela written originally for the screen, like Giliw Ko, 1939, Pakiusap, Tunay na Ina, Between Marikit and Madaling Araw. And even after the Pacific War, zarzuela-type films, now known as musicals, were made by the major studios like Sampaguita sa Rumbanggi, Premier's Pakyamo Neneng, and LBN's Ikaw Kasi, Bahala Na, and Waray Waray. By the 1970s, the jukebox musicals featured less and less of a real narrative. This jukebox musical, ito yung mga hits, American hits na in the films of Nora Honor. No? And so less and less of a real narrative and more American pop songs being crooned by teen idols Nora Honor, Tirso Cruz III, Vilma Santos, and Edgar Mortiz. The fourth form, the drama. Like the zarzuela, the drama was introduced into the country by Spanish troops in the 19th century and rose to popularity in the native languages during the American colonial period. The drama was a play, usually in prose, that focused on a love story between typical Filipino characters and situations, but did not have the songs of the zarzuela, although music could be used occasionally to highlight certain scenes. Three types of drama evolved from 1900 to 1940s. The drama simbolico, or allegorical play, used the love story to portray the political forces at odds in Philippine society in 1902 to 1905 and to attack American colonization.